On August 24, 1991, Ukraine declared its independence from the Soviet Union. 2.5 years ago, Russia launched an unjustifiable, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and today continues what is a decade-long assault against Ukraine's independence.
In the middle of August, UN-accredited reporters started asking us why is it that Western members of the Security Council are in no hurry to ask for a meeting on Ukraine this month. Is it, they asked us, is it that the United States and its allies decided to give up on their practice of artificially maintaining the Ukrainian issue in the Security Council, regardless of the real needs for its discussion by the Council?
Ukraine's people are fighting, defying the Kremlin's attempt to redraw Ukraine's borders by force. They are fighting valiantly and heroically, though Russia continues to brutally strike Ukraine's critical infrastructure.
The U.S. and satellites at the same time need to bear in mind the fact that the Ukrainian armed forces in Kursk are fighting using Western weapons. They use and lose German and American tanks and shell.
The Kremlin is endangering the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant.
There have been irrefutable evidence appearing that the Kyiv regime is intentionally shelling the Kursk nuclear power plant and is planning to take over it during a military operation.
Russia cannot and will not subjugate Ukraine. Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you, Assistant Secretary General Yenshev, for your briefing. On August 24, 1991, Ukraine declared its independence from the Soviet Union. 2.5 years ago, Russia launched an unjustifiable, full-scale invasion of Ukraine, and today continues what is a decade-long assault against Ukraine's independence. Ukraine has an inherent right to defend its independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity against Russia's aggression. This right is enshrined in Article 51 of the UN Charter. Ukraine's people are fighting, defying the Kremlin's attempt to redraw Ukraine's borders by force. They are fighting valiantly and heroically, though Russia continues to brutally strike Ukraine's critical infrastructure, as it did over the past weekend, launching its largest aerial attack since the war began, a volley of hundreds of missiles and drones, killing more than a dozen civilians and damaging energy facilities. In July, Russia hit Ukraine's Okhmedit Children's Hospital. In Putin's war of choice, Russia has forcibly transferred and deported thousands of civilians, including children, and caused 6.4 million refugees to flee the country and another 3.5 million to be internally displaced. There is no justification for these acts. Today, the Kremlin is endangering the Zaporizhzhia Nuclear Power Plant. We call on Russia to accede to the demand of 100 of its fellow UN General Assembly members and return control of the plant to the rightful, competent Ukrainian authorities. Russia cannot and will not subjugate Ukraine. The United States will continue to uphold the foundational principles of the UN Charter and support Ukraine against Russia's aggression as it preserves its independence. Ukraine and the United States made concrete progress by signing a historic bilateral security agreement in June. But we are not alone. With the Ukraine Compact, 32 NATO allies and partners pledged to support Ukraine's immediate security needs and maintain Ukraine's long-term defense and deterrence capability. Ukraine's Independence Day serves as a reminder of what is at stake: the fundamental principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity. Our commitment to those principles, like our commitment to Ukraine, will not waver. The United States will stand by Ukraine as it seeks a just and lasting peace consistent with the UN Charter. And when the world's leaders come to New York next month to reaffirm their commitment to the UN Charter, they are also reaffirming their support for a basic principle: Russia cannot redraw Ukraine's borders by force. The United States once again calls on Russia to stop its relentless attacks against Ukraine and to immediately withdraw its forces from Ukraine's territory. We hope that next year, Ukrainians will be able to celebrate their independence in peace. Thank you, Mr. President.
Спасибо, господин председатель.
Thank you, Mr. President. Colleagues, in the middle of August, the UN-accredited reporters started asking us why is it that Western members of the Security Council are in no hurry to ask for a meeting on Ukraine this month. Is it, they asked us, is it that the United States and its allies decided to give up on their practice of artificially maintaining the Ukrainian issue in the Security Council, regardless of the real needs for its discussion by the Council? Of course, we could not answer and provide an answer in the place of our Western colleagues, even though we do have a version or two as to why. The Ukrainian people looked very unfavorable during the Kursk adventure, and that is what Ukrainians themselves call the reckless attack by the Zelensky regime against the border peaceful region. Our Western colleagues simply could not overlook hundreds of pieces of evidence showing that in the Kursk Oblast, Ukrainian nationalists are executing peaceful citizens, including women and children, that they strike against civilian cars, that they launch drones and ambulances, the strikes against reporters and volunteers trying to save people from Ukrainian executioners, that they loot Russian villages, and then they post all of that on the internet. They also shell and destroy civilian objects, including residential buildings, schools, and hospitals, and they take hostage of peaceful citizens. And whilst they're doing that, they demonstrably use Nazi attributes and symbols. Some evidence for that is already something that we have shown during the ARIA meeting for the Security Council members on the 13th of August. And since then, their number has only grown. And this is happening at the territory which has no military facilities, which is mostly populated by peaceful women, children, and the elderly. Furthermore, there have been irrefutable evidence appearing that the Kyiv regime is intentionally shelling the Kursk nuclear power plant and is planning to take over it during a military operation. This kind of recklessness could trigger a nuclear incident with tragic consequences for the entire continent of Europe. And this is the best answer to those who is trying not to notice the Kyiv regime attack against the Zaporizhzhia NPP. This is what your unprincipled ostrich-like position leads to. This kind of action is uncomfortable even for Washington, London, and Brussels. Already in 2014, they have given a carte blanche to the Kievan Nazis for any kinds of crimes. The Western sponsors of the regime are also made uncomfortable by the fact that the true colors of the Kiev regime was shown during the attack on the Kursk Oblast and didn't even try to hide it. Clearly, this is not the best background possible to request a Security Council meeting, and that's why our Western colleagues waited until the very end of the month and requested a meeting under the wire, hoping that the thinking of the leader of the Kyiv regime will become clear by now, and there will be at least some positive outcomes by now of its adventurous and reckless decision. But the rationale and the reason for this suicidal Kursk adventure of the Ukrainian president has not become clear in any way, and the outcomes are even worse. Essentially, Ukraine has suffered greatly in terms of servicemen and materiel, but for some reason holds on to a few villages in Kursk Oblast, and using for that very few reserves, including the ones taken from the east, where, because of that, the Ukrainian front is collapsing. And the pace there of the Russian forces moving is growing. Every day we're liberating newer and newer population centers in Donbass. In the recent days, we've liberated Timofeevka, Novoselovka, Veselaya, Lysychna, Ivanovka, Sergeyevka, Sviridonovka, Zhelannaya, Межевое, Artyomovo, Kamyshovka, Orlovka, Konstantinovka, Novogrodovka, Kalinovo, and Membrik. This list also includes the Novorodskaya village, which under the Maidan authorities was being called New York for 3 years. Our units have already entered such important strategic points as Selidovo and Toretsk, which is going to become Dzerzhinsk soon, and Karlovku, and we are nearing the most important transportation logistic hub in Pokrovsk, which is going to then become Krasnoarmeysk. The average territory of the territory liberated daily in August grew twofold compared to July and became 11.2 square kilometers. And recently, it has reached the level of 30 square kilometers. It's important at the same time to remember that in the absence of reserves which are being used in the Kursk Oblast, now the Russian forces are freeing up the last strongholds that the Ukrainian forces used to hold since 2014, and this is only the beginning. Ukraine will have to pay for the Kursk adventure in full. We understand, therefore, full well that the request for the meeting today by the Western co-conspirators of Zelensky regime was done with a heavy heart. The U.S. and satellites at the same time need to bear in mind the fact that the Ukrainian armed forces in Kursk are fighting using Western weapons. They use and lose German and American tanks and shell using Western artillery. And there in Kursk, you also have Western mercenaries and consultants. And this means that the Western participation in the crimes of the Kyiv regime has become even more obvious for one and all. And this is something we're going to discuss on the 30th of August at the meeting on Western weapons supplies to Ukraine. Therefore, expecting that the United States and its NATO allies are going to be objective or even humane in assenting what is being done by the Ukrainian murderers and terrorists would be naive. But for such reasons, our Western colleagues do have the formula about the right of Kyiv to self-defense and protection from Russian aggression. And we have heard these expressions today in this room. They sounded false, and we'll continue hearing them. The representative of the United States this morning stated, and I quote, that no one member of the Security Council, when encountering a terrorist organization on its border, will not tolerate daily attacks and will not tolerate the displacement of tens of thousands of its citizens from that area. But such a position the United States have, but it's reserved for Israel exclusively. When it comes to crimes against Russia and Russians, Washington has not been paying attention for that for a long time. Mr. President, this reckless Kursk adventure undertaken by the Ukrainian president has one more consequence. You will recall that in June, the president of Russia put forward a peace proposal on Ukraine. It reflects a realistic situation on the front and takes into account the genesis of the Ukrainian crisis. For some time after that, the rhetoric of the Ukrainians has become more peace-loving, and many of our colleagues from the global south rushed to the conclusion that we're reaching the stage of peaceful negotiations. Those of you who thought that way did not take into account that the Kyiv regime cannot enter into any kind of an agreement. This was shown in the case of the Minsk agreements and also the peace agreement, which was initialized in Istanbul. And this time as well, the Kyiv regime deceived everyone who talked about peace together with them. Instead, they decided for escalation, and they attacked the Kursk Oblast, and all of the questions were removed this way. And I do hope that no one is left with any kind of an illusion, therefore. We never had them, and that's why we continue implementing the targets of a special military operation, instilling peace on Ukraine, which is something that the Zelensky regime is not interested in. Colleagues, in conclusion, I would like to call upon those members of UN who are Washington and allies are trying to bring into their geopolitical games by bribing elites. And please take a look at the example of Ukraine, and you will see what this kind of policy can lead to. Ukraine was the wealthiest of post-Soviet republics with a great military potential, and it now became one of the poorest states of the former USSR. Its economy is destroyed. Its industry is destroyed. Its land is being sold to Western corporations. It became a platform for American biolaboratories, and now is a platform for the testing of Western weaponry and use of the old one. Introducing Western-style democracy has led to the total absence of freedom of speech or even freedom of religion recently, to thousands of political prisoners, to the dictatorship of a president, the president who not only did not implement any of its promises of peace, which he made before the election, but led his country to suicidal war with Russia, defending Western geopolitical interests. And the result of that, he also, in addition to that, trampled underfoot the constitution of his own country and is throwing into the meat grinder hundreds of thousands of its nationals just to keep onto power. This is a true sad outcome that Ukraine has achieved by the 33rd anniversary of its independence. That is the cost of the mistakes and blunders made by the Ukrainian leadership so as to please the West. And probably understanding that this year, the Western countries, in contradistinction to previous years, decided to even forego any kind of action in support of Ukraine at UNHQ this day. Instead of that, they decided to spend time in the well-off Geneva, discussing the anniversary of IHP, which were being at the same time violated in Kursk. I would like to say that we believe that the bloody Ukrainian tragedy provoked by the United States and NATO, and that this will serve as a lesson for anyone who could potentially end up in a similar situation. I thank you.